Afghanistan, in terms of journalism, has a very large place, particularly amongst British and Irish correspondents. If you go back to the 19th century, the number of journalists working in that particular part of the world was probably almost equivalent to the numbers that have been working there in the last few years, and some very great reporters amongst them. Campaigning on the Oxus, the book Campaigning on the Oxus, the Merv Oasis, these fantastic stories by Times reporters and others, American reporters, some of them. Also struggling with trying to make sense of what was often an extremely complex situation. And I think that what Stephen Gray has done in his most recent book, this book that we're all here to look at and to talk about tonight, is to try and to make sense of these extraordinary complexities.
Well, I came back from that trip, which was actually my first trip out to Helmand, Afghanistan, and quite a sort of quick introduction from being in a sort of office in London to sort of 3 days later being out in the middle of all that. I was obviously quite struck by had a lot of different emotions about that whole episode, really. From obviously seeing the soldiers go through very traumatic moments of losing one of their closest comrades, to also seeing civilians being killed. And what intrigued me about what I was given the chance of getting back and meeting a lot of these people and going back out, and I said I would love to do that, but I'll do it my own way, and I won't, because the army gave me access, they offered me access to that. I said fine, but I'll do it, write my own book, and it will be I will try and look at everyone involved, not just the British Army, because there's been a few books about what the British are up to. Because I think what's very interesting about this conflict is how all these factors are, all these different agencies are working together. So I went back to Afghanistan again, and I followed through with the 52 Infantry Brigade, which was the brigade that was in Helmand at the time, and tried to interview as many people from as many units as possible. But also went to Kabul and Pakistan and interviewed Afghan officials, various intelligence people, and diplomats, and people on the American chain of command, generals on the American chain. And I went to the United States and met up with all the Americans who were involved in that same Musa operation I hadn't met at the time. It was very clear at the time this was a huge operation. It involved an attempt to, the background to the event had been an attempt by various agencies to turn a leading Taliban commander, and that was the spark for this whole operation, was turning that commander over. His name was Mullah Salam, and there was also a huge battle going on, of which I only witnessed part, and that was in the drive to show this was an Afghan operation to take this town. The very size of this battle had been essentially concealed, and it was really certainly the biggest British-led battle that had taken place in Afghanistan. And the more I got into it, the more interesting it got, really. And there was obviously this huge I found out what had happened in all the war cabinet meetings in Kabul, where this war is essentially run, and got a story that involved a great deal of intrigue, directly involving the president of Afghanistan, and I got to know something of what the British think of, and other allies think of, President Karzai and his rather indecisive and ineffective style of leadership.
You talked, Stephen, just in that introduction there, about the forces on the ground. Now, I mean, we can all do a fairly straightforward calculation. We can talk about the Afghan National Army, we can talk about the special forces on both sides, we can talk about the CIA, we can talk about the Marines, we can talk about the British Army, we can talk about NATO control, and we can talk about Operation Enduring Freedom. How can you make sense of what is happening? I mean, that's probably not a complete list, but all those forces are operating sometimes presumably under different chains of command.
Yeah, I think I counted there were, in Helmand, although you tended to sort of see on screen a British sort of commander of Task Force Helmand who would be running the show there. There was, I think, 7 different task forces at least that were operating in in that zone, and most of them at that time came under two separate commands. Operation Enduring Freedom, which is an American coalition command, which is separate, and NATO, and some American forces were under NATO, and some, particularly the special forces, were not. There was coordination between them, but it was a fairly sort of chaotic coordination. And I think one of the, striking to come across is how often conventional forces have to pick up the pieces, or at least take the consequence for actions taken by special forces. The Afghan people regard us foreigners as one, and therefore there's an incident at the end of my book where I talk about what happened to the 40 Commander, the Royal Marines, who were holding a lot of ground in the Helmand Valley, and constantly having to pick up the consequences of what was happening in special force raids, where civilians were being killed, not deliberately, but that was the consequence of the way that some of these operations took place. And they were not always told in advance that these were going to happen. So that in one instance, in a base just south of Sangin, they heard some firing in the night. They didn't know what it was. And the next thing they saw the next morning was a truck drive up to the base with, I think, 12 bodies on board, or maybe it was more actually, about 18 bodies on board. It was an entire family had been wiped out, except for an 11-year-old kid, an extended family of about 11 people, because they'd been living in a compound which had also been used for a Taliban sort of council of war. So there'd been a very accurate strike on a Taliban meeting, but it also, because of the nature of the weapons used, there's a special force gunship had been used to sort of strafe the area and essentially kill those people that were moving around in that area. Those Royal Marines were absolutely distraught, because they hadn't been told about this, and they were trying to make friends in that area and to deliver sort of a doctrine of counterinsurgency whereby you only win by winning over people in the area you operate in. And yet they had to then pick up the consequences of this actions taken by another unit, but also operating under a separate command. I mean, I think some of that has changed, but that was the situation when as I looked into it then.